Teacher spots note in girl's sock, reads it and calls 911. They were banging on the front door hard. If there was someone inside, then they would have heard. "Hello? Hello, miss, can you hear me?" the officer screamed. One of the female officers walked to the side of the porch and peeped through a window. "Dougie, look, I think I can see someone inside. Looks like a person," she said urgently. Would they be able to open the door? Jenny Morrison was a strong and determined mother from Okemos, Michigan. She had a 6-year-old daughter named Claire. Claire was a quiet child, often appearing withdrawn and carrying an air of sadness that her teacher, Mrs. Singh, couldn't help but notice. Mrs. Singh suspected that Claire might have been going through some trauma at home, but she never interfered or asked Jenny about it, respecting the delicate boundaries of her student's personal life until one day. Mrs. Singh, a compassionate and observant teacher, had always felt a deep concern for her quiet student Claire. The little girl seemed distant and traumatized, often arriving at school with a melancholy expression on her face. Mrs. Singh suspected that something was amiss in Claire's home life, but she respected boundaries and never interfered. One day, as Mrs. Singh glanced at Jenny, she noticed a black eye peeking out from under her sunglasses. Concerned for her well-being, Mrs. Singh approached Jenny during pickup time and asked if everything was all right. Jenny, with a forced smile, quickly lied and explained it had been a silly accident, but the careful teacher wasn't easily fooled. She was genuinely concerned. As Jenny Morrison dropped Claire off at school, Mrs. Singh couldn't help but notice the dark bruised circle around Jenny's eye. She had to find out what was going on. Concerned, she approached Jenny and gently asked if everything was all right. Jenny hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting around nervously, finally saying, "It's nothing, Mrs. Singh. I just accidentally walked into a door." Mrs. Singh's heart sank at the obvious fabrication, but she decided to trust Jenny's words for the time being. Throughout the day, however, her thoughts lingered on that black eye and her unease grew steadily. Days passed and Claire failed to show up at school. Every morning, Mrs. Singh anxiously awaited her arrival, hoping for the best but fearing the worst. Finally, on a gloomy Monday morning, Claire's father dropped her off at the school gates. Relief washed over Mrs. Singh as she collected the pale and frail girl who appeared weaker than usual. Mrs. Singh thought it was strange that Jenny wasn't there that morning. She'd only ever seen Mr. Morrison once before on the first day of school. Mr. Morrison saw Mrs. Singh rushing over to the truck and quickly jumped in so as not to make eye contact or conversation. Mrs. Singh looked dead straight into Mr. Morrison's eyes as he drove away. As Mrs. Singh helped Claire settle into her seat, she noticed something peculiar sticking out from the little girl's sock. Being curious, she bent down and gingerly pulled at it. To her astonishment, she found a crumpled piece of paper tightly pushed into Claire's tiny sock. It seemed as though Jenny had got Claire ready for school with a special purpose in mind. Mrs. Singh approached Claire gently, her eyes filled with both concern and curiosity. She helped the child settle into her desk, trying to gauge how she was feeling that day. As Mrs. Singh knelt down to adjust Claire's sock, she noticed something sticking out of it, a crumpled piece of paper. Instinctively, she pulled at it. The teacher was nervous. She didn't know what to expect. Claire was already such a sensitive child, but she had to check for herself. Unfolding the note, Mrs. Singh's eyes widened with shock. The message scrawled in Jenny's hurried handwriting sent chills down her spine. Was it real? How could she understand what was going on? Claire was little and wouldn't be able to explain anything. Mrs. Singh's heart sank, realizing that her suspicions were indeed founded. She fought back tears, overwhelmed by the weight of the situation and the responsibility that now lay upon her. Her eyes widened as she read the desperate plea written in Jenny's handwriting, "Call the police, don't send Claire home." Shock and concern flooded Mrs. Singh's heart as she realized the gravity of the situation. She discreetly tucked the note away, not wanting to cause alarm in front of Claire. "Did your mommy put this there?" she asked Claire, and the girl nodded yes. With a heavy heart, she decided to take action immediately, determined to protect both Jenny and Claire from further harm. She could stop something worse from happening. A surge of urgency propelled Mrs. Singh into action. She immediately showed the note to the school principal, who shared her alarm. "We need to get the authorities involved," Principal Baggins said. With the principal watching over Claire, Mrs. Singh dialed the emergency number, her voice trembling as she reported the distressing situation to the police. Principal Baggins was enraged as he waited. He was a short, strict man. He loved teaching and had a passion for educating children. "Not in my school, the nerve of him. Some people shouldn't be parents," he huffed. Within minutes, law enforcement arrived at the school, their concern mirrored in their eyes as they read the note. Would they be able to help in time? The authorities raced to the Morrisons' address a few blocks away. It was an old area and the house was dilapidated and falling apart. Mr. Singh accompanied them to Claire's home, where they found the doors locked and no response from within. Desperation filled the air as they shouted Claire's name, pleading for a sign of life. They were starting to get more concerned. There was no response from the inside. They tried the back door, but it was locked. "Are there any other windows open up there?" one officer asked. Were they too late? A haunting silence greeted their calls until a faint noise reverberated from within, a sound resembling something heavy hitting the floor. Everybody turned to face the direction the noise came from. "What was that?" the main officer said, edging toward the door. I heard it too, Mrs. Singh said, trying to look inside, but it was dark. The police knew they couldn't waste any more time. They forcefully broke down the door, revealing a scene that would forever be etched in their memories. Mrs. Singh screamed in shock. It was a bloody sight. Jenny lay on the floor, battered and bloodied, her pain evident in every bruise and cut. The room bore signs of a violent struggle, a testament to the suffering she had endured. The officer rushed to her side, shining the flashlight on her face. "She's breathing. We need to get her out of here fast," she said, trying to get Jenny conscious. "Jenny, can you hear me?" Mrs. Singh said, trying to offer some sort of comfort to the battered woman. "Claire's fine. She's safe, okay?" She tried to give the distraught woman some hope. The police quickly called for an ambulance, ensuring Jenny's safety and immediate medical attention. While paramedics tended to Jenny's injuries, the police sprang to action, determined to bring the abuser to justice. Meanwhile, back at the school, Claire remained blissfully unaware of the tumultuous events unfolding around her. The principal sat her down in a warm and comforting space, gently explaining that her mother had been hurt but that help was on the way. Claire's wide eyes filled with worry and confusion, her innocence shattered by the painful truth of her family situation. But this wasn't the end for the young girl and her mother. For young Claire, this information was a hard pill to swallow. Girls her age weren't usually in such positions, and from the looks of it, she didn't even know what the note had to say. She was quivering, her eyes were glistening with tears, and the principal could only imagine what she must have been going through at that point in time, but the worst was yet to come. Everyone knew that Claire was too young to understand what was happening, but she could see what was going on behind closed doors, and before long she'd understand why her daddy wasn't coming home. That didn't mean things would become easier though. After all, this was over. The damage would have already been done. It would have taken years for her to fully recover from the situation. During the entire explanation, Claire didn't say a word. She just looked at the principal with big sparkling eyes and trembling lips. Her heart ached with worry and questions flooded her young mind. Would her mom be okay? Would she ever see her smile again? Would they have to leave their home? The principal turned pale. Mrs. Singh could see the fear and uncertainty in Claire's eyes. She knelt down beside the young girl, taking her small hands in hers. "Claire, your mother's receiving help right now. The police and doctors are taking care of her," she reassured gently, trying to provide some solace. But little Claire still had a helpless look of fear in her eyes. "Will mommy be okay? Is she gonna be safe?" Her innocent question tugged at Mrs. Singh's heartstrings. "I promise you, Claire, we'll do everything we can to keep your mommy safe," Mrs. Singh replied, her voice filled with sincerity. "Right now, the police are working hard to catch the person who hurt her. You and your mommy are not alone in this." As the words settled in, a mix of emotions flickered across Claire's face. Fear, confusion, and sadness intertwined. She was too young to comprehend the full weight of the situation, but she understood enough to know that her world had been shattered. In the midst of the chaos, the Child Protective Services were contacted to ensure Claire's well-being in her safe temporary home. Mrs. Singh knew that Claire would need support and love during this difficult time. Days turned into weeks as Claire adjusted to her new living situation. She was placed in the care of Mrs. Singh and her family, who understood the delicate nature of her circumstances. They showered her with affection, trying to provide a sense of stability in her life. Meanwhile, the investigation into Jenny's case intensified. The police worked tirelessly to gather evidence and build a strong case against her abuser. They were determined to bring justice to Jenny and ensure that she and Claire could live free from harm. As news of Jenny's ordeal spread throughout the community, people rallied together to support her and Claire. Fundraisers were organized, meals were delivered, and offers of assistance poured in from neighbors, friends, and even strangers. The outpouring of love and compassion helped to restore a glimmer of hope in the midst of the darkness. But Mrs. Singh knew that Jenny wasn't out of the woods yet, and it was hard for her to talk to Claire about it without her getting upset. The principal knew what was coming next, and he wasn't prepared for it. It took the gathering of all his nerves to tell her that her mom was in critical condition. But how could he possibly tell her that her dad had been a prime suspect and the police were on a manhunt looking for him? Mrs. Singh knew that it was important for Claire to see her mother and maintain a connection during this challenging time. She arranged for supervised visits between Claire and Jenny at the hospital, ensuring that Claire felt loved and supported. On the first visit, Claire clung tightly to Mrs. Singh's hand as they entered the hospital room. Tubes and wires surrounded Jenny, but Claire's eyes lit up with a mix of pain and joy at the sight of her mother. Claire was very emotional to see her mother even though she was unconscious. Claire approached her mother cautiously, unsure of how to react. Tears streamed down her face as she held her mother's hand tightly. Mrs. Singh sat nearby, silently witnessing the heartwarming reunion. It was bittersweet, knowing they had a long road ahead of them, but also filled with hope that they could heal and rebuild their lives together. Over time, Claire's visits to the hospital became more frequent. She started to open up to Mrs. Singh about her fears, worries, and confusion. They attended therapy sessions together where they learned about healthy coping mechanisms, boundaries, and rebuilding trust. It was a challenging journey, but with each small step, their bond grew stronger. Mrs. Singh knew that she had to help Claire until her mother finally woke up, but who knew when that would be? As days turned into weeks, Claire continued to hold a daily vigil at her mother's bedside, never losing hope that Jenny would wake up. Mrs. Singh, always by Claire's side, ensured that the young girl stayed focused on her schoolwork and provided a comforting presence during this difficult time. She knew that if Claire occupied her mind with something else, she wouldn't feel so depressed about her mother. The news of Jenny's ordeal spread throughout the community and support continued to pour in. The local news covered the story, shedding light on the issue of domestic violence and rallying even more support for Jenny and Claire. Donations poured in, enabling Jenny to receive the best medical care available and aiding in their long-term recovery. Despite the progress they were making, there were moments of setbacks and emotional turmoil. Claire often struggled with feelings of guilt and confusion, blaming herself for not being able to protect her mother. Mrs. Singh spent countless hours comforting and reassuring Claire, reminding her that none of what happened was her fault and she wasn't alone. As time went on, Claire began to find solace in expressing her emotions through art. She would spend hours drawing and painting, pouring her heart out onto the canvas. Mrs. Singh recognized Claire's talent and arranged for her artwork to be displayed at a local art gallery, giving the young girl a sense of accomplishment and pride. Meanwhile, the police were still on the hunt for Jenny and Claire's abuser. It was like he'd disappeared off the face of the earth. Mrs. Singh and everybody could just hope that he'd be found so that Claire and Jenny could live their lives in peace and not have to look over their shoulders. The principal knew that the young girl before him was facing so many challenges at that point in time, and for someone her age, those obstacles looked like gigantic mountains. He also knew that nothing he said would make the situation any better, but he still tried his best to assure her that everything would be fine in the long run. Was he right? As the hospital authorities worked tirelessly to restore Jenny to a stable state, Mrs. Singh stayed by her side, offering support and reassurance. She became a guiding light for both mother and daughter, a beacon of hope in their darkest hours. She barely knew them, but she prayed that the poor woman wouldn't succumb to any more harm. Mrs. Singh stayed by Jenny's side the entire time, and she swore to remain there until the woman was well enough to sustain herself. The only time she left was when she called the principal to find out how Claire was doing, and to update them on Jenny's condition, which was still incredibly unstable. Would the young mom make it out? Hours had passed by and Jenny showed absolutely no signs of improvement, and then things took a turn for the worse. Jenny was crashing. As the sight before her crushed the young teacher, she clasped her hands together and did something she hadn't done in a long time. She started to pray, begging for the young mom to make it out of the situation. In a matter of seconds, the room was filled with medical staff. Doctors were barking orders while nurses ran to do what they were told. But for Mrs. Singh, everything was happening in slow motion. The events were starting to take their toll on her and she couldn't handle it. This was the first time in her life she'd seen something so tragic. As she stood aside and watched the doctors do their jobs, her mind turned to what happened that tragic day. Everything that had happened started playing through her mind. From the moment she saw her note to the journey to the hospital, it was all flashing before her eyes and tearing down all her defenses. Tears started rolling down Mrs. Singh's cheeks as she watched the events unfold once more. She just couldn't believe what she'd gone through that day, what Claire had gone through. But it was the moment the officers arrived that stuck with her through it all. It was a bittersweet moment that cost her young student her family. The police arrived at the hospital residence promptly, finding her battered and bruised. They wanted an official statement from Mrs. Singh and Jenny. She's in no state to speak. She hasn't even woken up yet. Please, Mrs. Singh tried to protect her. The police took Mrs. Singh's statement and tried to collect more evidence about Mr. Morrison. They intended on catching him out. Mrs. Singh gave the officers all the information she knew, but it wasn't as helpful as she thought it would be. In order for them to put an end to this madness once and for all, they'd need to find Jenny's husband, and they needed someone who could tell them where he was. Would they be successful? Mrs. Singh told the officers that she could try the school's admin desk. They generally had all the information that was needed when it came to their parents. The school needed work numbers for both parents in case something happened to one of the children, and if they were lucky, they'd have an address as well. The officers wouldn't have to wait that long, though. As soon as Mrs. Singh left the room, Jenny opened her eyes. As Mrs. Singh saw that the woman had gained consciousness, her heart skipped a beat. Would Jenny be willing to speak up against her husband, or would she avoid it at all costs? They'd find out soon enough. The officers asked Jenny to make a statement about what happened that day, and she was all too happy to oblige. She told them everything they needed to know and more, but there was one piece of information that meant that more than the rest combined. Did the officers finally have what they were looking for? The officer's voice was laced with pain when he asked, "Do you know where we can find your husband?" Jenny swallowed the lump that formed in her throat. Was she ready to give the man up, or would she keep suffering at his hands? Tears flowed down her cheeks as she opened her mouth to speak. The moment of truth had finally arrived. The detective managed to get the information about Mr. Morrison's workplace. He was a cashier for a fishing shop near the lake. It was a bit of a drive out. Armed with the address of Jenny's husband's workplace, they swiftly apprehended him, ensuring that he would never pose a threat to Jenny or Claire again. When the authorities arrived at the fishing shop, their sirens were blaring. Mr. Morrison knew that they were there for him and he tried to run away. "Don't let that man get away!" the officer screamed across the grounds. He slipped and fell down the fire escape and the officer was able to catch him. They arrested Jenny's husband, ensuring that he would face the consequences of his actions. Mr. Morrison was incarcerated for domestic violence and abuse. In the days that followed, Jenny began the long journey of physical and emotional healing, surrounded by a community that rallied to her aid. Social services provided temporary shelter and support, ensuring the safety of Claire while Jenny regained her strength and rebuilt her life. Meanwhile, Mrs. Johnson was in contact with local support services to provide Jenny with the necessary resources and support to rebuild her life. Through therapy and counseling, Claire slowly found her voice, her quiet demeanor transforming into a resilient spirit. Her experience had taught her empathy and the importance of speaking up against abuse. With the guidance of Mrs. Singh and other caring individuals, she blossomed into a beacon of resilience, determined to break the cycle of violence. The story of Jenny, Claire, and Mrs. Singh became a catalyst for change within the community. Awareness campaigns were launched, empowering others to speak out against domestic abuse and offer support to those trapped in its vicious grip. The once silenced voices gained strength as more people began to take a stand against the hidden horrors that plague families behind closed doors. Jenny's journey toward healing and empowerment inspired many others, shedding light on the often unseen battles fought by survivors of domestic violence. Although Jenny was embarrassed at first, she got over her own emotions and was proud of who she was. She had overcome the worst pain and was fighting every day for her little girl. And within the walls of that small school, Mrs. Singh's act of bravery and compassion rippled through the lives of countless children. Her unwavering dedication to her students transformed not only Claire's life, but also the trajectory of her entire family. The pain and trauma that once overshadowed their existence gradually gave way to a future filled with love, support, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow.